Mainland attacked during World War II?
Yes, the continental United States was hit twice during the war. But with no casualties and only minimal damage. The first attack occurred at approximately 7 p.m. on February 23, 1942, when a Japanese submarine shelled an oil storage field at Elwood Beach, California, about 12 miles north of Santa Barbara. The Japanese were trying to hit oil tanks there, evidently with the intent of producing a spectacular explosion. But after firing a reported 16 or 17 rounds, they had struck only a pier. Most of the shells fell into the sea, well short of their targets. U.S. planes gave chase, but the submarine got away. There were no injuries and only minimal damage. But the event put the nation on heightened alert to the possibility of more attacks. The February 23 attack took place shortly after President Franklin Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, had begun his fireside chat, addressing the nation over the radio. He talked about how this war was different, since it was being waged on every continent. Every island, every sea, every air lane in the world. He also said, the broad oceans which have been heralded in the past as our protection from attack have become endless battlefields on which we are constantly being challenged by our enemies. The unsuccessful assault at Elwood was the first attack on mainland U.S. soil since the War of 1812, 1812-14. The event stirred fears of conspiracy and rattled nerves up and down the West Coast. There was one other strike on mainland soil during World War II, at Fort Stevens, Oregon, at the mouth of the Columbia River. On the evening of June 21, 1942, a Japanese submarine fired some 17 rounds of shells at the coastal military installation but caused no damage.
What is Shinto?
Shinto is the dominant religion of Japan. Its traditions call for the reverence of ancestors, prayer, and the observance of rituals. It is polytheistic, believing in many gods, kami, who are thought to be the forces behind nature as well as behind human conditions such as sickness, healing, and creativity. Followers of the Shinto religion believe these spirits are housed in shrines. Private shrines are erected in homes while public shrines can be highly elaborate, including multiple buildings as well as gardens. The latter are the goals of many religious pilgrimages. Pilgrims pray and make offerings, of money and flowers, to the spirits. Originating in Japan in ancient times, Shinto has an interesting modern history. In 1882, religious organizations were divided into two groups: state shrines and sectarian shrines. State Shinto was controlled by the government, which went so far as to proclaim divine origins for the Japanese emperor. After World War II, 1939–45, state Shinto crumbled and Emperor Hirohito. 1901–1989, was compelled to renounce his divinity. Sectarian Shinto religion still thrives in Japan today, where it has more than 3 million followers.
Were the Spaniards the first Europeans to reach North America after the Vikings?
No, that distinction goes to explorer John Cabot, c. 1451–1498, who in 1497 sailed westward from Bristol, England, in search of a trade route to the east. Cabot's story began in 1493, when Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506, returned to Spain from his New World voyage, claiming to have reached Asia. From the accounts of the trip, Cabot, who was himself a navigator, believed it was unlikely that Columbus had traveled that far. He did, however, believe it was possible, as did subsequent explorers, to find a route, a northwest passage that ran north of the land mass Columbus had discovered, and by which Asia could be reached. In 1495 the Italian Cabot, born Giovanni Caboto, took his family to England, and the following year, in March, appealed to King Henry VII, 1457–1509, for his endorsement in pursuing the plan. For his part, the king, who was well aware of the claims made by the Spanish and Portuguese who had sponsored their own explorations, was eager to find new lands to rule. And so he granted a patent, authorizing Cabot's expedition. Later that year, 1496, Cabot set sail. But problems on board the ship and foul weather forced him to turn back. The following spring, on May 20, 1497, he sailed again, in a small ship that had been christened Matthew. The crew of 20 included his son, Sebastian. On June 24, they sighted land and Cabot went ashore. While he saw signs of human habitation, he encountered no one. From reports of the trip, scholars believe Cabot had reached the coasts of present-day Maine, Nova Scotia, and probably Newfoundland. He then sailed home, returning to England on August 6. He reported to the king 6 days later and was given a reward, as well as authorization for a more sizable expedition, which he undertook in May 1498. This time Cabot set sail with 5 ships in his command. But the expedition was not heard from again.
What does the Declaration of Independence say?
The Declaration of Independence, adopted July 4, 1776, has long been regarded as history's most eloquent statement of the rights of the people. In it, not only did the 13 American colonies declare their freedom from Britain, they also addressed the reasons for the proclamation, naming the causes which impel them to the separation. and cited the British government's violations of individual rights, saying the history of the present King George III of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, which aimed to establish an absolute tyranny over these states. The opening paragraphs go on to state the American ideal of government, an ideal that is based on the theory of natural rights. The Declaration of Independence puts forth the fundamental principles that a government exists for the benefit of the people and that all men are created equal. As the chairman of the Second Continental Congress Committee that prepared the Declaration of Independence, it was Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, who wrote and presented the first draft to the Second Continental Congress on July 2, 1776. The passage that is most frequently quoted is this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness."
Why is mythology so widely studied?
The mythologies of various peoples are studied for their religious meanings, for their similarities to each other, and as a way of understanding the culture that originated them. Through the centuries, scholars have arrived at various conclusions about mythology. Scottish anthropologist Sir James Fraser, 1854 to 1941, studied folklore and religion and found parallel beliefs between the systems of primitive cultures and Christianity. He published his theories in the highly influential work titled The Golden Bough, 1890, proposing that all myths center on the cycles of nature and birth, death, and resurrection. Polish-born English anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, 1884 to 1942, asserted that myths are nothing more than the validation of accepted social behavior and patterns within a culture. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, 1875 to 1961, posited that all cultures have unconsciously formed the same mythic symbols or motifs, called archetypes. To many theologians, mythologies are viewed simply as corruptions of the Bible. Whatever their meaning or however they are interpreted, myths have figured prominently in literature from the 5th century BC works of Greek tragedian Aeschylus to the 20th century works of poets T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens.
When was poker invented?
The card game, in which a player bets that the value of his or her hand is higher than those held by the other players. was invented in the 1820s by sailors in New Orleans. The sailors combined the ancient Persian game as NAS with the French game POC, which itself was a derivation of the Italian game Primera, and a cousin of the English game Brag. Poker was originally played with 3 cards from a deck of only 32 and included combinations such as pairs and 3 of a kind. The game was later played with 5 cards from a deck of 52 cards, and the draw was also added. Stud poker, where each player is dealt their first card face down and the next 4 cards face up, didn't come into existence for many years, until about 1864. Other later additions to the game were the straight, a hand consisting of 5 cards in sequence but not of the same suit, and the flush, a hand consisting of 5 cards of the same suit but not in sequence.
When did Halley's Comet first appear?
Its first noted appearance was in 239 B.C., but it was British astronomer Edmund Halley, 1656 to 1742, who noted that the bright comet he observed in 1682 followed roughly the same path as those that had been observed in 1531 and 1607. He suggested that they were all the same comet and that it would reappear in 1758. It did reappear, and it was therefore named for Halley, who was England's second astronomer royal. Thanks to Halley, the common man could rest a bit easier at night, before the British astronomer proved, through his observations and previous astronomical data, that comets are natural objects subject to the laws of gravity. People had viewed occurrences of comets as harbingers of doom. Halley's comet has been observed by astronomers every time it has appeared since 239 BC. Most recently seen in 1985 and 1986, the comet will make another appearance in 2061, and roughly every 76 years thereafter. It's also worth noting that it was Halley who encouraged his friend and fellow scientist Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, to write his theory of gravity, which he did, Principia Mathematica, which Halley used his own money to publish, appeared in 1687 and is considered a seminal work of modern science.
When was the first alphabet created?
The earliest form of an alphabet, a set of letters with which one or more languages are written, was developed between 1800 and 1000 B.C. by a Semitic people of unknown identity. In 1928, in the northern Syrian city of Ras Shamra, clay tablets were discovered with a cuneiform, wedge-shaped, alphabet of characters. According to most scholars, these early Semitic inventors got the idea of developing an alphabet because of their contact with Egyptian hieroglyphics. Although some of the Semitic symbols were Egyptian, the system of writing was distinctly their own, consisting of 22 characters representing only consonants. There were no written directions for vowels. The reader had to supply the vowels from his or her knowledge of the language. The characters were developed this way. Important Semitic words were selected so that each would begin with a different consonant. Then, stylized pictures portraying the words, mostly nouns, were assigned the phonetic value of the initial sound of each word. For example, the first character in the Semitic Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, originally meant and was the symbol for an ox head. The second, Beth, which came to represent the sound B, meant house, and renderings of the symbol reveal a shelter with a roof. The Phoenician alphabet, developed c. 1000 BC, is believed to have been derived from this early Semitic alphabet. In turn, the Greeks, in about 500 BC, adapted the Phoenician alphabet for their own use.
What was Enron?
Enron was a high-flying energy trading and communications company headquartered in Houston, Texas. It was the seventh largest corporation in the United States, a favorite on Wall Street. And for 6 years in a row, 1996 to 2001, was named America's most innovative company by Fortune magazine. Then Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in December 2001. Rocking the business world and shocking investors and rank-and-file employees. It was, for a short time, the largest bankruptcy in American history. Federal investigators later learned that the company's collapse was caused by fraudulent accounting practices that allowed Enron to overstate earnings and hide debts. The conglomerate had booked billions in profits that did not really exist and created mythical companies to bury heavy losses. Enron's stock price plummeted, there were massive layoffs, employee retirement accounts heavily invested in Enron stock were decimated, executives resigned, and criminal indictments followed. Its accounting firm, Chicago-based Arthur Andersen, collapsed under the weight of its involvement in the scandal. Enron soon became emblematic of a much larger problem, the so-called breakdown of corporate America. It was the first of several colossal business failures, the biggest of which was the collapse of telecom giant WorldCom. In July 2002, WorldCom, valued at $180 billion and serving 15 million customers at its 1999 peak, filed for bankruptcy. WorldCom eclipsed Enron to earn the dubious title of largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Again, fraudulent business practices were to blame. In March 2005, a federal jury convicted former WorldCom Inc. CEO Bernard Ebbers of engineering $11 billion in fraud. He was also found guilty of conspiracy and of filing false financial reports. The conviction was critical to prosecutors in a host of pending cases connected to corporate scandals, including Enron, whose former chairman, Kenneth Lay, and former CEO, Tom Skilling, were awaiting trial, set for 2006. A Fortune magazine writer reflected on the crisis of corporate ethics, saying, "Phony earnings, inflated revenues. Conflicted Wall Street analysts, directors asleep at the switch. This isn't just a few bad apples, it is a systemic breakdown." Enron happened to be first, and it became the symbol for the many. In 2005, Enron was in the process of distributing remaining assets to creditors and liquidating other operations. WorldCom, meanwhile, emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 as MCI Inc., the name of one of its subsidiaries.
Who were the know-nothings?
The know-nothings were members of AU's political movement during the mid-1800s, Americans who feared the foreign influence of immigrants. There was an influx of new arrivals in the 1840s, banded together, sometimes in secret societies, in order to uphold what they believed to be the American view. When people who were thought to be members of these groups were asked about their views and activities, the typical response was, "I don't know," which gave the movement its name. The Know-Nothings worked to elect only Native Americans, U.S. born citizens, to political office. And they advocated the requirement for citizenship be 25 years of residence in the United States. Since many immigrants came from European countries and were Roman Catholics, the Know-Nothings also opposed the Catholic Church. In 1843, Know-Nothings formed the American Republican Party. By 1854 they had allied themselves with factions within the Whig Party and in the state elections held that year. Know-Nothings swept the vote in Massachusetts and Delaware, nearly carried New York and Pennsylvania, and pulled substantial votes in the South. The following year, the Know-Nothings dropped much of their secrecy and became known simply as the American Party. It was the issue of slavery that finally split the party in the national election of 1856. And the group dissolved after that. Anti-slavery members of the American Party joined the newly formed Republican Party.
What was abscom?
Abscom was an undercover operation conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, to ferret out corrupt government officials and prosecute them. In 1978, agents began posing as American representatives of Arab businessmen whose company, the fictitious Abdul Enterprises Limited, was willing to buy political influence in the United States. Abscom comes from the first two letters of the business name, with the word scam added to the end. The trap was set. The first to be caught was Congressman Michael Ozzie Myers, 1943, of Pennsylvania, who was videotaped accepting a $50,000 bribe and saying, "I'm going to tell you something real simple and short. Money talks in this business. Other officials also fell prey to the sting operation. All of them were arrested on charges of bribery and conspiracy. The first of 7 trials got underway in 1980. None of the officials were acquitted. Most faced fines and/or imprisonment, and all of them lost their offices. The wide net cast by Abscom had caught 1 U.S. Senator, 6 representatives in Congress, 1 mayor, 3 members of the Philadelphia City Council, 1 INS. Immigration and Naturalization Service, inspector, 1 lawyer, 1 accountant, and many of their associates. The FBI operation and the resulting trials and punishments sent a loud warning to any public official subject to influence.
What were the international contributions to the War on Terror?
According to the U.S. Central Command, by early 2005 there were 70 nations supporting the global war on terror, and 21 nations had deployed more than 16,000 troops to the U.S.-led operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Coalition forces contributed in a variety of ways, including providing intelligence, personnel, security assistance, equipment, and other assets for use in ground, air, and sea operations. Coalition members also provided humanitarian aid to civilians.
What are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
The scrolls are ancient manuscripts of great historical and religious importance. They were found in dry riverbed caves on the northwestern side of the Dead Sea, a salt lake situated between Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan. More than 800 scrolls have been found, with the most famous discoveries made in 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found miles apart at a number of different sites, including Khirbet Qumran in the West Bank, formerly Israel. The texts date to different centuries but include fragments of every book of the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, except the Book of Esther. Some texts are almost identical to Bible texts used today, showing that much of the Old Testament is the same as it was 2,000 years ago.
What is the social contract?
The social contract is the concept that human beings have made a deal with their government, and within the context of that agreement, both the government and the people have distinct roles. The theory is based on the idea that humans abandoned a natural, free and ungoverned state in favor of a society that provides them with order, structure, and, very importantly, protection. Through the ages, many philosophers have considered the role of both the government and its citizens within the context of the social contract. In the theories of English philosopher John Locke, 1632 to 1704, The social contract was inextricably tied to natural law, the theory that some laws are fundamental to human nature. Locke argued that people first lived in a state of nature, where they had no restrictions on their freedom. Realizing that conflict arose as each individual defended his or her own rights, the people agreed to live under a common government, which offers them protection. But in doing so they had not abandoned their natural rights. On the contrary, argued Locke, the government should protect the rights of the people, particularly the rights of life, liberty, and property. Locke put these ideas into print, publishing his two most influential works in 1690. Essay Concerning Human Understanding and two treatises of government. These works firmly established him as the leading philosopher of freedom. His writings profoundly influenced Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826. Author of the Declaration of Independence, 1776, which asserts that there are self-evident truths, natural laws, that people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, natural rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, one of the great figures of the Enlightenment. A cultural period of the 17th and 18th centuries, during which reason was celebrated as a superior human virtue, later published a book on the subject of the social contract. In his book titled Social Contract, 1762, he wrote that people enter into a binding agreement among themselves, and it is incumbent upon them to establish their government and government systems. According to Rousseau, people have a duty to obey only legitimate powers, meaning that only the people can decide who governs them. Rousseau's ideas helped promote the causes of the French Revolution. 1789 to 99, and the American Revolution, 1775 to 83. The concept of the social contract as defined by Rousseau materialized in the Declaration of Independence. 1776, which proclaims that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. The well-known words of the Americans' Creed, written in 1917 by William Tyler Page, 1868 to 1942, of Maryland, also asserts these principles: I believe in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed.
When was the bicycle invented?
A series of inventions during the 1800s resulted, in 1876, in the introduction of the safety bicycle, the direct ancestor of the modern bike and the first commercially successful bicycle. It had wheels that were equal in size, making it easier and safer to ride than its high-wheeler predecessor. The bikes proliferated, By 1900 more than 10 million Americans owned bicycles. As with other inventions, the bicycle was the result of the work of several innovators. In 1817 German Baron Karl Friedrich Freiherr von Drais de Sauerbrunn. 1785 to 1851, developed a device that resembled a scooter. Named for its inventor, the Draisienne later improved by Scotsman Kirkpatrick Macmillan. 1813 to 1878, who in 1839 added pedals to the vehicle, giving the world the first real bicycle. In 1870 English inventor James Starley, 1830 to 1881. Designed a bicycle with a large front wheel and small rear wheel. Named the Ariel, the invention was also called a penny farthing. After two very different sized British coins, the high wheeler, and the ordinary. Though the bicycle was easier to pedal and faster, one revolution of the pedals turned the front wheel once. Its high center of gravity made it unstable and even dangerous. The innovation of the tricycle, or velocipede, improved the design of the Ariel by giving it the added stability of the third wheel. But it was not until the safety bike was developed in 1876 that the bicycle's popularity took off.
Why did the United States get involved in World War I?
When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, Americans opposed the involvement of U.S. troops, and President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, declared the country's neutrality. But as the fighting continued and the German tactics threatened civilian lives, Americans began siding with the Allies. After the sinking of the passenger liner SS Lusitania, Germany adopted restricted submarine warfare. But early in 1917 Germany again began attacking unarmed ships. This time American cargo boats, goading the United States into the war. Meantime, German U-boats were positioning to cut off shipping to and from Britain. In an effort to force the power to surrender. Tensions between the United States and Germany peaked when the British intercepted, decoded, and turned over to President Wilson a telegram Germany had sent to its ambassador in Mexico. The so-called Zimmermann Note, which originated in the office of German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann. 1864 to 1940, urged the German officials in Mexico to persuade the Mexican government into war with the United States in order to reconquer lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The message was published in the United States in early March. 1 month later, on April 6, 1917, the U.S. Congress declared war on Germany. After President Wilson had asserted that the world must be made safe for democracy.
Is it true that Moses stuttered?
Yes, the Bible indicates that Moses had a speech impairment, which caused him to fear the mission that God gave him. In the book of Exodus, 4:10, just after Moses has been called by God and told to go to the Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt. He appeals to the Lord, saying, "If you please, Lord. I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue," and, later, 4:13, "If you please, Lord, send someone else." God reassures Moses and instructs him to go meet his brother Aaron the Levite, who is eloquent and will speak to the people for Moses.
Were the anthrax attacks acts of terrorism?
Yes, as U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft said. When people send anthrax through the mail to hurt people and invoke terror, it's a terrorist act. Investigators believed the attacks, which killed 5 people and sickened 17 others, were acts of domestic terrorism. But whoever was responsible for mailing anthrax spores in the fall of 2001 remained unknown in mid-2005. Some observers believed the attacks were carried out to expose the nation's vulnerability to bioterrorist attacks.
What was the importance of Martin Luther's 95 Theses?
The Reformation as a movement began on October 31, 1517, when the German monk and theology professor Martin Luther 1483–1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany. The Theses, which are arguments or assertions, question the value of indulgences, the pardons that were disseminated by the Church, and condemned the sale of them. Luther had already begun to preach the doctrine of salvation by faith rather than by works. And during 1518 he went on to publicly defend his beliefs, which were in direct opposition to the Church. The following year he expanded his argument against the Church by denying the supremacy of the Pope. In 1521 Pope Leo X, 1475–1521, declared Luther a heretic and excommunicated him. Ordered to appear before the Diet of Worms in April 1521, Luther refused to retract his statements of his beliefs, saying, "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God." The following month, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500–1558, issued the Edict of Worms, declaring Luther to be an outlaw and authorizing his death. But the Prince of Saxony, known by history as Frederick the Wise, 1463–1525, saw fit to protect Luther, whom he had appointed as a faculty member at the University of Wittenberg. Founded by Frederick the Wise in 1502. There Luther translated the New Testament into German and undertook a translation of the entire Bible. Luther continued the Protestant movement until his death in 1546.
What is empiricism?
Empiricism is the philosophical concept that experience, which is based on observation and experimentation, is the source of knowledge. According to empiricism, the information that a person gathers with his or her senses is the information that should be used to make decisions, without regard to reason or to either religious or political authority. The philosophy gained credibility with the rise of experimental science in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it continues to be the outlook of many scientists today. Empiricists have included English philosopher John Locke, 1632–1704, who asserted that there is no such thing as innate ideas, that the mind is born blank and all knowledge is derived from human experience. Irish clergyman George Berkeley, 1685–1753, who believed that nothing exists except through the perception of the individual, and that it is the mind of God that makes possible the apparent existence of material objects, and Scottish philosopher David Hume, 1711–1776, who evolved the doctrine of empiricism to the extreme of skepticism that human knowledge is restricted to the experience of ideas and impressions, and therefore cannot be verified as true.
Who was Alice Paul?
Alice Paul, 1885–1977, was a groundbreaking feminist before the word feminist came into fashion. The Mount Laurel, New Jersey, institute named in her honor describes her as the architect of some of the most outstanding political achievements on behalf of women in the 20th century. Paul was born in 1885 to Quaker parents who instilled in her a belief in gender equality. After completing high school the top in her class, Paul graduated from Swarthmore College in 1905 and began work toward an advanced degree. In 1906 she traveled to England, where she continued her studies, did social work, and became actively involved in the suffrage movement. She was arrested 3 times for her involvement in protests. In 1916, when the American women's suffrage movement was divided and dead in the water, Paul founded the National Woman's Party, NWP, an organization that spearheaded the campaign for national women's suffrage and that continued working for women's rights and equality into the 21st century. Paul's leadership of the suffrage movement was critical in the passage of the 19th Amendment, 1920, which guaranteed women the right to vote. She organized thousands of activists to put enormous pressure on the White House and Congress. Paul employed what was then considered a most unladylike strategy of sustained, dramatic, nonviolent protest. The suffrage campaign was characterized by national speaking tours, marches, and pickets, including the first ever at the White House. When protesters were arrested, they sometimes endured brutal prison conditions and staged hunger strikes. After passage of the 19th Amendment, Paul continued her studies, adding to her master's degree in social work, 1907, a doctorate in economics, 1912. She earned 3 more advanced degrees, culminating in a Doctor of Law degree in 1927 from American University. Called a brilliant political strategist, the forward-thinking Paul authored the first Equal Rights Amendment for women, which she introduced to Congress in 1923. In 1942 she became chairperson of the National Woman's Party. She later added language of gender equality to the Charter for the United Nations as well as the 1964 Civil Rights Act. After a life of courageous activism on behalf of women, Paul died in 1977.
What caused the nuclear accident at Chernobyl?
The April 1986 accident, the world's worst nuclear power plant disaster, was caused by explosions at the Soviet power plant, sending radioactive clouds across much of northern Europe. According to the World Nuclear Association, the accident was the result of a flawed reactor design that was operated with inadequately trained personnel and without proper regard for safety. The trouble began at 1:24 a.m. on Saturday, April 26, when Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, about 70 miles outside of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, was rocked by 2 enormous explosions. The roof was blown off the plant and radioactive gases and materials were sent more than a half-mile into the atmosphere. Though 2 workers were killed instantly, there was no official announcement about the hazardous blast. It was the Swedes who detected a dramatic increase in windborne radiation. And on April 28, 2 full days after the accident, news of the event was briefly reported by the Soviet news agency TASS. 2 weeks later, on May 14, First Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, 1931, went on national television and explained what officials knew about the accident. More details were revealed over the following months. The explosions were caused by an unauthorized test carried out by plant operators who were trying to determine what would happen in the event of a power outage. There were 6 critical errors made by workers during the testing, which combined to spell disaster. Perhaps the most significant of these mistakes was turning off the emergency coolant system. Once the test was underway, further mistakes caused the core to heat to more than 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit, producing molten metal that reacted with wet cooling. Water was left to produce hydrogen gas and steam, resulting in a powerful explosion. What caused the second explosion is not clear, and experts disagree on what might have happened. Some theorize that it was a pure nuclear reaction.
What was the Holy Roman Empire?
The Holy Roman Empire, sometimes abbreviated HRE, was a loose federation of German and Italian states. Originally formed on Christmas of AD 800, when Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, 742 to 814, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III, c. 750 to 816. But after Charlemagne's death, the empire lapsed and was not fully reinstated until Otto I, 912 to 973, was crowned emperor. Though the empire was strongly associated with the Roman Catholic Church, disputes between emperors and popes began in the mid-1100s. In 1250 Pope Innocent IV, d. 1254, was successful in gaining independence from the empire for the Italian city-states. Later in the history of the Holy Roman Empire, the House of Habsburg rose to power. But after the 1648 signing of the Peace of Westphalia, which recognized the sovereignty of all the states of the empire, the title of Holy Roman Emperor was for the most part an honorific one. With the exception of a 5-year period, 1740 to 45, the family continued to hold power. Until 1806, when Emperor Francis II, 1768 to 1835, declared the end of the Holy Roman Empire.
How was it that Anne Frank's diary survived World War II?
The young German Jewish girl's diaries, which chronicled 26 months of hiding from the German authorities in Amsterdam during World War II, 1939 to 45, were given to her father, Otto Frank, 1889 to 1980, when he returned to Holland from Auschwitz after the war. The notebooks and papers had been left behind by the secret police, and were found in the Frank family's hiding place by 2 Dutch women who had helped the fugitives survive. Otto Frank published his daughter's diaries in 1947. 20 years later, the English-language edition, The Diary of a Young Girl, was released. It was subsequently made into a play and a film, both called The Diary of Anne Frank. The diary is an astonishingly poignant account of the suffering and heroism during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Anne Frank, born in 1929, had known religious persecution her entire life. She was only 4 years old when her family escaped Nazi Germany in 1933 and fled to the Netherlands. During the Nazi occupation of that country, beginning in 1942, the Frank family hid in a secret annex behind her father's office at 263 Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. It was there that Anne lived with 7 others for just more than 2 years, recording her thoughts in 3 notebooks. But the family was finally found, on August 4, 1944, by the Nazis, who arrested them and put them in German concentration camps. In March 1945, 2 months before the German surrender, Anne Frank died of typhoid fever in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Of the 8 who had hidden in the secret annex, Anne's father, Otto, was the only survivor.
What happened in the anthrax scare of 2001?
The anthrax scare unfolded shortly after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. When news first broke that anthrax-laced letters were received at East Coast media outlets and U.S. congressional offices, there were fears that the spreading of the infectious bacterium was linked to the 9/11 attacks. But the investigation later pointed toward a domestic perpetrator, still unknown in mid-2005. According to a report from the Office of Homeland Security, the anthrax events began on October 2, 2001, when an infectious disease doctor in Palm Beach County, Florida, reported a suspected case of inhalation anthrax. That diagnosis was confirmed by the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, on October 4, and the information was released to the public, rattling the nerves of an already jittery nation. On October 5, the first victim of the anthrax attacks, the 63-year-old South Florida man who had been hospitalized, died. On October 7, investigators announced that evidence of the anthrax bacterium was found in his workplace. The Florida offices of American Media Inc., AMI, publisher of the National Enquirer, Sun, and other tabloids. On October 12, New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani announced that an NBC News employee in the office of anchorman Tom Brokaw had tested positive for cutaneous, skin, anthrax, a less dangerous form of the bacterium. 3 days later, it was reported that a letter containing suspicious powder was opened in the office of Senator Tom Dashley, South Dakota, in the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. The next day the powder tested positive for anthrax. October 16 brought the news that the infant son of an ABC News producer in New York City had tested positive for exposure to the skin form of anthrax. The baby had visited the ABC News offices weeks earlier, and officials believed exposure had occurred at that time. The same day, it was announced that a second AMI worker, a 73-year-old mailroom employee, was diagnosed with inhalation anthrax and was in intensive care. The announcements brought the number of confirmed anthrax cases to 4, 2 inhalation and 2 cutaneous. Within days, CDC officials had linked all 4 cases to the intentional delivery of B. anthracis spores through mailed letters or packages. The FBI urged the public to handle any suspicious packages with care, to not open, smell, or taste them, and to call 911 immediately. On October 18, a worker at CBS News in New York was reported to have been infected with skin anthrax. The next day the public learned that an editorial assistant in the Manhattan offices of the New York Post had also been diagnosed with the skin form of the disease. Also on October 18 and 19, the CDC confirmed diagnoses of both inhalation and cutaneous anthrax in New Jersey postal workers, who had begun showing symptoms of infection on October 13. Between October 19 and 22, 4 workers from a Washington, D.C. postal facility were confirmed to have been infected with inhalation anthrax and were hospitalized. On October 22, 2 of them died. 2 days later, the U.S. Postmaster General announced to the public, "There are no guarantees that the mail is safe," and he advised hand washing after handling the mail. On October 31, a New York hospital worker died of inhalation anthrax, becoming the fourth fatality. But investigators could not determine how the woman had been exposed to the bacterium. By mid-November, traces of anthrax had been discovered in mail facilities that supplied the CIA. The Senate and House office buildings, the Supreme Court, Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, the White House. Washington, D.C.'s Brentwood Mail Processing and Distribution Center, Washington, D.C.'s Southwest Postal Station. A Kansas City postal facility, the Pentagon's post office, and 4 more New Jersey postal facilities. Antibiotics were distributed to thousands of workers as a preventive measure. On November 16, an anthrax-laced letter addressed to Senator Patrick Leahy, Vermont, was discovered in a batch of quarantined Capitol Hill mail. The handwriting, all uppercase, was similar to that in the letter addressed to Senator Dashley. And the 2 letters carried identical messages: September 11, 01/You cannot stop us/we have the anthrax. /You die now. /are you afraid /death to America. /death to Israel. /Allah is great. The letters sent to the senators were postmarked October 9, 2001, in Trenton, New Jersey. The message and handwriting in those letters were also similar to those in letters addressed to the editor of the New York Post and to Tom Brokaw at NBC News, both of which read, September 11, 01/This is next/take penicillin sick now/death to America/death to Israel/Allah is great. The letters sent to the media outlets were postmarked September 18, 2001, also in Trenton, New Jersey. The Franklin Park, New Jersey return address was identical on all 4 letters. But it was a non-existent location. Investigators believed that whoever sent out the deadly missives was familiar with the area. On November 20, it was confirmed that an elderly Connecticut woman, who had died the day before, had been infected with anthrax. The 94-year-old was believed to have been exposed to a letter that had been cross-contaminated in the mail. All 5 anthrax deaths were caused by the inhalation form of the bacterium. In total, 22 cases of anthrax were identified between October 4 and November 20, 11 of them were the deadly inhalation form. 6 people survived, and 11 were the less serious skin form. In all but 2 cases, the New York hospital worker and the elderly Connecticut woman. The victims were mail handlers or were exposed to work sites that had been contaminated by mail. Investigators concluded that all of the anthrax spores were of the same strain, called Ames, but that the letters contained different grades of the bacterium. By November 9, 2001, the FBI had issued a behavioral/linguistic assessment of the offender based on the known anthrax parcels. The offender is believed to be an adult male who has access to a source of anthrax and possesses the knowledge and expertise to refine it. The FBI headed a multi-agency effort to identify the perpetrator of the deadly attacks.
How has MTV affected the music industry?
MTV's almost immediate impact was to launch the music careers of fledgling artists. Some critics believe that superstar Madonna, who showed up on the music scene at about the same time as MTV, would not have risen to the heights of fame that she has were it not for music television. Or at least her star might not have risen so quickly. But she and other media-savvy artists exploited the new format to reach the music-buying public the world over, for soon MTV had a global presence. The video channel also gave established artists a boost by airing more than one single off a given album, resulting in several hits from any one recording. Such was the case for artists like Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen, U2, and Peter Gabriel. Increasingly creative videos gave the works of album-oriented musicians longer lives and steady sales. MTV quickly established itself and the format as an integral part of the music industry. Once the format was proven viable, other music television channels emerged, including VH1, which was begun by media mogul Ted Turner and was later bought by MTV and molded into an adult-oriented music station. The Nashville Network, TNN, which aired country music videos and programming in the 1980s and 1990s, and country music television, CMT. Today, the music video remains an important tool for new and established artists alike. Media analysts also believe MTV has had an impact on modern culture. Since the channel relies on interesting visuals to capture viewing audiences, MTV is constantly upping the creative ante for artists who freely experiment with bright colors, images, rapid-fire editing, motifs, dreamlike imagery, and other visual techniques, which began showing up on other television shows, in movies, and in advertising. Some observers believe the phenomenon has ushered in a new visual order. Of course, MTV has its detractors. Critics argue that the MTV aesthetic is superficial, and that it is accelerating the movement away from traditional forms of literacy. While MTV is praised and panned in the worldwide media, there's no arguing that the music channel continues to be a window on what's hip and hot to the American youth.
Who were the great Islamic philosophers of the Middle Ages?
Three thinkers of the Islamic world stand out as important interpreters of Greek thought, and therefore, as a bridge between ancient philosophy and the scholasticism of the Middle Ages. Their Latin names are Avicenna, Averroes, and Avicenna. Avicenna, c. 878 to 950, who studied with Christian Aristotelians in Baghdad, Iraq, proved so adept at applying the teachings of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. To Muslim thought that he became known as the second Aristotle or the second teacher. He posited that philosophy and religion are not in conflict with each other. Rather, they parallel one another. Also known for his work in interpreting the great Aristotle for the Muslim world. Avicenna, 980-1037, is sometimes referred to as the third teacher. He was also the first to expand the distinction between essence and existence. Averroes, 1126-1198, also was no stranger to Aristotle, writing commentaries on him as well as Plato. Specifically, the Republic, he also wrote on religious law and philosophy as well as religion and logic.
Why was Mohandas Gandhi called Mahatma?
Mohandas Gandhi was called Mahatma, meaning great-souled, by the common people, who viewed him as India's national and spiritual leader. He is considered the father of his country. He was born in India on October 2, 1869. As a young man, Gandhi studied law in Britain. Practicing briefly in India, he then travelled to British-controlled South Africa on business. Observing oppressive treatment of Indian immigrants there, he held his first campaign of passive resistance. Gandhi would later become very well known for this method of protest. Called Satyagraha, meaning firmness in truth. Back in India as of 1915, Gandhi organized a movement of the people against the British government there. Britain had taken control of India during the 1700s and remained in power. After World War I, 1914-18, Indian nationalists fought what would be a long and sometimes bitter struggle for political independence. While Gandhi's protests took the form of nonviolent campaigns of civil disobedience, such as boycotts and fasts, hunger strikes, he was more than once arrested by the authorities for causing disorder. As his actions inspired more extreme measures on the part of his followers, whose protests took the form of rioting. As a member and, later, the president of India's chief political party, the Indian National Congress, Gandhi led a fight to rid the country of its rigid caste system, which organizes Indian society into distinct classes and groups. In Gandhi's time, not only were there four Varna, or social classes, but there was a fifth group of untouchables who ranked even below the lowest class of peasants and laborers. Improving the lot of the untouchables was of tantamount importance to the leader, who by this time had abandoned Western ways in favor of a life of simplicity. Beginning in 1937, Gandhi became less active in government, giving up his official roles. But he continued to be regarded as a leader of the independence movement. During World War II, 1939-45, he was arrested for demanding British withdrawal from the conflict. Released from prison in 1944. Gandhi was central to the post-war negotiations that in 1947 resulted in an independent India. A believer in the unity of humankind under one God, he remained tolerant to Christian and Muslim beliefs. Amidst an outbreak of violence between Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi was on a prayer vigil in New Delhi when a Hindu fanatic fatally shot him in 1948.
What is privateering?
Privateering is the hiring of privately owned ships and their crews to fight during battle. The practice, dating back to the 1400s, continued well into the 1800s. Eventually replaced by the development of strong navies. Privateers were, essentially, gunboats for hire. They played a crucial role in the American Revolutionary War, 1775-83, after the Second Continental. Congress authorized their use on March 18, 1776, enabling the colonists to capture about 600 British ships. The Americans would again employ privateers in the War of 1812-14. But during times of peace, some privateers turned to pirating, which at least in part prompted European nations to sign the Treaty of Paris of 1856, which ended the Crimean War, 1853-56, and outlawed privateering. Since the United States had relied on privateers in the past and had yet to develop its own navy, the Americans did not sign the treaty. While there was some privateering during the American Civil War, 1861-65, the need for them soon subsided as navies developed by enlistment and draft. Privateering has not been used in more than 100 years.